Good morning, everybody, and welcome back. I hope you had a good weekend, and I hope that everybody is safe and well, and that you stay that way. I want to remind you, please, that we have a test on Friday, and this covers tissues and membranes, the integumentary system, and the musculoskeletal system, which we will probably almost finish today and certainly finish on Wednesday. I remind you also that there are study guides for each of those three sections. There are study guides put up on Canvas for you to use, for you to do your revision. And in addition, on Wednesday, we will be having a live class. I'll try and keep whatever I need to teach that day, if anything. I keep it really short so that you have plenty of time to ask questions. But please come with specific questions. Don't come and with like, can you explain the integumentary system? Okay. Come with specific questions which have arisen from your revision using the study guides or whatever. So today we're going to carry on talking about the musculoskeletal system, mostly about the skeleton. I will bring in a little bit about muscles, not a huge amount. But we've been talking about the skeletal system. And of course, one of the features of the skeletal system is that it is closely tied to our ability to move and to locomote, etc. In order to do so, the skeleton, which is, by the way, is called an endoskeleton. That means a skeleton inside, to distinguish it from animals, for example, which have a skeleton outside. They have a hard outer skeleton, which is called an exoskeleton. Ours is an endoskeleton. In order for that to work, it has to be jointed in order for us to be able to move, etc. And so we actually recognize three kinds of joints in the skeletal system. Not all of them, by the way, are movable. Some of them are not movable. Here is one. These are called the synarthroses. Synarthrosis means jointed together. And typical would be in the skull. You remember you learned some of the bones of the skull, and the bones of the skull are jointed. That is to allow a certain amount of growth, although the skull doesn't actually ever grow that much. We're pretty much born with a skull which is pretty close to what the adult skull is, but nonetheless, there are joints between the plates, between the bones of the skull. And those are called synarthroses. They are immovable. They actually look like this. They kind of fit together, tongue and groove sort of thing. And they are immovable joints. The next kind is an amphiarthrosis. And an amphiarthrosis is a joint which allows a certain amount of movement, but it's limited. And very typically, those would be the joints, for example, between the vertebrae, which allow a certain amount of movement, allows the spine to bend forward, for example, and also allows a certain amount of rotation. But the movement is limited, although the bones have cartilage between them and they're proper joint structure, which we'll see in a minute, a proper synovial joint structure. Just don't worry about that word. We'll discuss it in a minute. But amphiarthrosis, the movement is limited between bones. The joint that we're going to spend some time talking about is this one here, and it's called the diarthrotic joint or a diarthrosis. And diarthrotic joints are joints which are freely movable, and they allow movement in many directions. And the typical example would be the ball and socket joint of the hip. This here, it is here. And the other important ball and socket joint is of the shoulder, the joint that joins the shoulder, the arm bones, up to the shoulder girdle. And so this is a typical diarthrotic joint, and it has what is called a synovial structure. And I'll explain that. I'll remind you, when we talk about tissues and membranes, you remember we talked about a synovial membrane. Now, a synovial membrane is a double membrane. And it secretes fluid. So that is what gives this joint its name. And here's the synovial membrane here. This joint here is being cut through, so you can imagine that synovial membrane completely encloses the joint. And here's the synovial membrane here, and it can be going all the way around like a collar, but fixed to the cartilage of the bone there and there. And this synovial membrane secretes a fluid, and it is called the synovial fluid, and it is cushioning and lubricating fluid that fills that joint. You can see here, these are the ends of the bones, and they are capped with very smooth cartilage, which articulates one against the other. And so it's called articular cartilage, because it articulates. And the whole thing, the whole joint, is enclosed and given strength by a tough connective tissue layer, which is all around the joint. And the whole thing together is called the bursa. Everything that's enclosed by that connective tissue around the outside, which is called the joint capsule, this whole thing is called the bursa. And in actual fact, you may, if some of you who are sportsmen, if you have overworked a joint or strained a joint, you may have pain in a joint, which the doctor will diagnose bursitis. Bursitis is simply some form of inflammation in the joint. And that is because this whole thing is called the bursa. So what the structure is: outside capsule, very strong connective tissue. Here's the bones of the joint itself. Synovial membrane, secreting synovial fluid between, and then it is there are articular cartilages to allow smooth movement of the joint. And don't forget, there's something that that is left out here, and that is very probable that this joint is further strengthened by having strong ligaments between the bones to give the joint strength. So this is the typical basic diarthrotic structure. And but there are 4 kinds of diarthrotic joint. And the first is the ball and socket joint. And that's, as I've just told you, the leg and the arm. The second is a hinge joint. And a hinge joint allows movement in one direction, one plane only, as your arm, for example. Then there's another kind of joint called a pivot joint. And the best example of that is also on the arm. You have where you can rotate your arm like this. You can rotate your hand thanks to a pivot joint in the arm. The last are the gliding, articulating surfaces of the spine. Now, those are diarthrotic, but they are actually regarded as being amphiarthrotic because the joint movement is limited. But they have that typical structure. The bursa will look just like the diagram that I've just shown you. So let's have a look. We won't necessarily do all of these, but here's typical ball and socket joint there, and of course here as well. Hinge joints here in the elbow, but also in the knee. Don't worry about saddle joints. Gliding joints, there are joints which allow bones to slide against one another, and the typical there would be how the collarbone here joins to the scapula. A pivot joint allows for rotational movement. So that, you remember we talked about the atlas and the axis. That is a typical pivot joint. And I think that's all that you need to know for those. So just ball and socket, hinge, the plane, and the pivot. So let's have a look now and see, yeah, things do go wrong with the bones. And one of the commonest things to happen is that bones can be broken. Bone is very, very strong. And it may sound strange to say it, but one of the things that gives it strength is that it has a certain amount of flexibility. You remember that the bone itself is laid down in a bone matrix. And that matrix is, you can think of it really as being like very solid cartilage. That has a certain flexibility. That means the bone can be stressed quite a bit, and it will actually bend. But if you overstress it in any way, then you can end up actually snapping the bone, breaking it. This is a very dangerous and a very, very, very painful event. And the reason it's so painful, I remind you that the outside of the bone is covered with a layer of connective tissue called the periosteum. And the periosteum is very, very rich in nerve endings and in pain receptors. And that is one of the reasons why breaking a bone is so intensely painful. We recognize various kinds of breaks. So for example, this here is called a green stick fracture. And the reason for that is you see the break here is not all the way through. So the bone is still entire on one side, and there's a crack that's just like if you took a green stick and you bend it for break where it's most heavily stressed, while on the other side it stays entire. That's a green stick fracture. A spiral fracture is one that's a break all the way through, and it's not straight across. It actually spirals up the bone, and that has got a lot to do with the structure of the bone itself. Because the bone is hollow, it's a cylinder, and also because of the structure of the Haversian systems inside, it leads to this kind of spiral break. This is a break called a comminuted fracture. And this is very typical of somebody that has fallen and has landed on their feet. And the stress, where the stress here in these breaks is in this direction sort of thing. The stress here is in that direction. It is vertical. And it leads to these very, very complex fractures of the bone, and often a shortening of the bone. A transverse fracture is one, or again, is rather similar to the spiral, excepting it goes straight across. It goes straight across the bone. Now, the most dangerous of all of these is this one here. This is a compound fracture. And it's compound not because it involves all of the bones, but because the bone here actually protrudes through the skin. This is a very dangerous situation because this bone is now open to the air, and infection can be introduced into the bone. And once we acquire infection in a bone, it is often extremely difficult to treat. It's often very, very difficult to get sufficient antibiotic into the bone, for example, through the circulatory system, in order to wipe out this infection. And these compound fractures need to be very swiftly treated. If ever you are involved in a situation like you have to give first aid or whatever, where there is a compound fracture, the the first aid procedure is simply to cover this with a clean cloth. Not under any circumstance try and push the bone back in. That must be done under sterile theater conditions. But you cover the bone with clean cloth to try and prevent any further infection. Okay, those, unfortunately, we do break bones, but broken bone heals. Don't forget, bone is a living tissue. And so it heals, and there is a process for its healing. The very first thing is, first of all, bone is richly supplied with blood, so that these breaks often cause hemorrhage around the bone. And sometimes that hemorrhage is enclosed by the periosteum around the outside of the bone. A collection of blood, of free blood like that is leaked out of severed vessels is called a hematoma. Blood blister is a hematoma, a small hematoma. This kind of hematoma, if this was a femur that had been broken, this would be a very large hematoma. But that is part of the healing process. This blood, don't forget, once we stop blood from moving, then blood actually will start to clot. It forms a dense clot, and that is part of the healing process. The body will very quickly establish new blood vessels through the clot, and will begin now to lay down. Just 1 minute, please. Sorry, my cat is yelling. It will begin to lay down new bone. Don't forget, what we're going to see osteocytes laying down new bone. And at the start, it will be soft. There will be a lot of some cartilage and everything laid down in here. And then gradually that gets filled in with entirely new bone. It very often leaves a scar on the bone. And this, the area around where the fracture was, often denser bone than was original. So it's the fracture heals as a very strong healed patch. Okay, let's talk about some other things that go wrong with bones. This is the commonest disorder that arises from aging and from overuse of a bone, but it can also arise for another reason. This is arthritis. And this is inflammation of the joints, which leads eventually to loss of cartilage in the joint, and it leads to scarring and to bone being laid down into the joint, so that the joint no longer moves smoothly one bone against the other. It can be intensely painful. There are two ways in which arthritis arises. The first is called osteoarthritis, and this is typical old hands. I have it in my hands. This is age and overuse that leads to this. You're basically just wearing out the joint, and the joint ends up not working as well. And the new bone that is laid down inappropriately, and the joint begins to bend and deform like this. It leads to a tremendous weakening of the hands. The strength of the hands is often lost. The treatment for that is usually with anti-inflammatories, if at all, but there's not really a lot that can be done about it. This type of arthritis here is different. This arthritis can arise anywhere in the body, not just not only in heavily worked joints, and it's due to an autoimmune response. That means the body's immune system starts to see its own tissue as being foreign. The job of the immune system to recognize foreign matter coming into the body and fight it. But occasionally things go wrong. And when that happens, the immune system begins to fight the body's own proteins especially. And here the body is attacking the proteins of the cartilage that is inside the joints. And it leads to this tremendous deformation and loss of use of these joints. And as I say, this can be systemic. It can be throughout the whole body in any of the joints where there is cartilage that the autoimmune response is being directed at. And the usual treatment for this is actually to try and suppress the immune response in some way, often with steroids, which will, like cortisone, which will limit the amount of attack to the joints. Okay, now I want, when you're watching, if you're watching this, I want you to stop this video now. Okay, we've had about 20 minutes of me talking. Stop, go to your PowerPoint notes, go through, sit down now and go through all of the slides, all of these slides, sorry, that we've been through, okay? And make sure you understand and are able to memorize the different features, okay, on each slide before you proceed. So take a few minutes now. Also, just clear your mind. Do something, get up, run around the room, come sit down again, look through your PowerPoint slides, and then proceed. Okay. So, hi, welcome back. So, let's have a look at the spine itself. Now, there are a lot of disorders that can arise in the spine, mainly because the spine is so complex. Remember, it has all of those different bones contained in it. And when we look at the structure of the spine, we'll see this is absolutely the normal structure. This is how it should be, with this lazy S curve in it. There in the lumbar region, there is a hollow there. And this here we call the kyphosis. But that kyphosis can actually end up being very much exaggerated, as here. And that when it's exaggerated like that, we call it lordosis. The kyphosis can lead to this humping here, and that we call kyphosis there. So kyphosis is that humping because this becomes exaggerated. Lordosis is where this becomes enormously exaggerated there. And we refer to this, you can have both together, and that we call kypholordosis. So that's kypholordosis. So this is in one plane, right? But in actual fact, the spine can also be distorted in 3 dimensions. And have a look here, that we refer to as scoliosis. So we've got kyphosis, lordosis, and scoliosis. And in fact, to tell you the truth, it is very, very frequent that most people have some kypholordosis, and may even have, very few people have an absolutely straight spine. They may have a very slight scoliosis. But scoliosis can become extreme, as shown here, and it can go into 3 dimensions. That is what produces, if we a distinct humping of the back. That would lead to the condition of the humpback kind of condition in its extreme. Okay. So there you can see here, there is a problem with scoliosis. First of all, it puts tremendous wear on the vertebrae, inappropriate stresses onto the vertebrae. But second of all, it leads to compression. You can see here, you can see how the chest on this side is compressed. It leads to compression of the organs on that side. And nowadays, scoliosis is corrected as soon as it possibly can be. For example, people may have rods inserted into the on either side of the vertebrae to straighten the spine and to correct that scoliosis. So here's a little bit of extra credit for you for 1%. Okay. I don't just want a name. I want the story explained, and I want the structure explained. Here's a skeleton. And this, I'll tell you that the skeleton was excavated from a graveyard in a church, in the floor of a church. So, and it's obvious that this person had very severe scoliosis. And in fact, this it looks like it's two-dimensional. It was actually three-dimensional, so he actually would have had a distinct hump. So he's a very famous person. And you will easily be able to find out who he is. I want you to tell me his story, but I want you to explain carefully what his disorder was and how that might have affected him, how it might have impeded him. It didn't impede him very much, I must tell you. But it would surely have had some ill effects on him, and I want you to explain that to me. So you can email that to me and get that to me by October 14th. Okay, so that's the week of Indigenous Peoples Day, which is on the 12th. That's the Wednesday. Please, when you send it to me, send it with a very clear subject line saying extra credit, all right, so that I can pick it up quickly in the hundreds of emails that I have. Okay, so here's another very, very common disorder, and this is called osteoporosis. Osteoporosis arises because of an imbalance in calcium metabolism. You'll remember, I told you bone is a very good store of calcium. And sometimes the body will actually extract calcium from bone, but there's always a balance. It's always, it deposits deposits calcium back into the bone. It doesn't withdraw so much. Under proper circumstances, it won't withdraw so much that the bone is weakened. But under certain circumstances, the bone has so much calcium removed from it that it actually becomes weakened. And this is especially tied to hormonal changes with aging. This is very common in women, much more common in women than it is in men, but it does affect men as well sometimes. And what happens is that as the bone weakens, as the calcium's removed, you begin to get little tiny fractures. The person doesn't, it's not painful. The person doesn't even notice, but the bone begins to kind of collapse. So it produces this very, very typical, this is an elderly woman. Here's a normal spine. This is an elderly woman where the vertebrae, wherever they come under stress, are beginning to collapse, and it ends up pushing her spine into this hump here, often called a widow's hump. Here, for example, is a normal bone. There's a normal vertebra, and you can see the bone is, it looks spongy, but it's very, very strong. All of these little cells end up making this vertebra very, very strong. But here is a 75-year-old woman with osteoporosis, and you can see the bone has lost its strength because it's had its calcium removed, and all of these begin to weaken, and the whole vertebra can begin to collapse as those cells collapse. So that is osteoporosis. There are treatments for it, but they usually consist of hormone replacement therapies and then also there are things you can do to change the calcium metabolism. it is extremely disabling. It becomes extremely disabling. The posture is entirely lost. The spine becomes compressed, and it really can become extremely serious. All right. So that's all that I'm going to talk about for the skeleton. So I just want to introduce some muscular systems, and we're not going to talk about it over much, all right? It's fairly basic. So obviously, our muscle systems on our body are extensive and very complex. There are really hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of muscles. And in fact, I'll tell you that they keep discovering new ones. It's one of the favorite pastimes of anatomists is to look for tiny, obscure muscles and give them a name. So we keep on increasing the number of muscles that are known. So the muscular system has three principal responsibilities. Obviously, body movement. It's how we move, it's how we locomote and everything. So that is the first. And the second responsibility is actually maintenance of body form and of posture. Remember that we are operating against the force of gravity. Human beings especially, we stand upright for almost all our life, and we require special muscle adaptation in order to do so against the force of gravity. There's a third responsibility which you may not have thought of. We maintain a constant body temperature around 37 degrees Celsius. And a tremendous amount of that, the heat that we generate in our bodies is generated by our muscles, by muscle movement. And in actual fact, muscles are always slightly contracted. There's always some slight activity going on in muscles. That baseline contraction we call the muscle tone. And muscle tone is seldom lost, entirely lost, until somebody dies. But muscle is continually active and when it's active, when the metabolic processes are going on, the muscle will be generating heat, which is what we use to maintain our constant body temperature. So just remind you, we have done this before. So this should be a reminder for you. Reminder that there are three kinds of muscle tissue. And we recognize skeletal muscle, which we call voluntary or striated muscle. That's the bulk of our muscles. Smooth muscle, that is muscle of things like the reproductive tract, the gut. These are muscles which are not under voluntary control. They are under nervous control of part of our nervous system that we'll learn about later, called the autonomic nervous system, the unconscious part of our nervous system. The third kind of muscle is very specialized, and that is cardiac muscle. And these, where am I? I thought I had pictures for you to remind you, but in any case, please go back, and I'll just remind you here. Skeletal muscle is called striated muscle because it is very distinctly striated. Smooth muscle is not. Smooth muscle is lens-shaped cells with no visible striations. Cardiac muscle are cells which are joined to one another with branches, and they are faintly striated. Okay, go back to tissues and membranes and revise that skeletal muscle. In fact, why don't you do that now? Take a break, take a few minutes now, go back to tissues and membranes and have a look at the structure of skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, and cardiac muscle. And then come back here. Take 5 minutes to do that and go over the slides that we've already covered. Okay, welcome back. Okay, here, the muscle has some very distinct properties, all muscle, and that make it what it is. This is how muscle works. First of all, muscle is contractile. That is, it can be shortened in order to do work. That contractile nature is conferred by the fact that it has fibers of actin which run all the way through it, which interact with another protein, a motor protein called myosin. And when it contracts, the myosin reaches out, grabs the actin fibers, and pulls them together to shorten the muscle. That is what makes muscle contractile. The second thing is a little bit more difficult to understand. Muscle is excitable. That has a very specific meaning in biology. The other excitable tissue is nervous tissue. And that is if the cell is stimulated, either nerve cell or a muscle cell, it produces an electrical pulse. And that pulse is called the action potential. And that is able to do things. It is, in the case of nerves, it can transfer information, for example. In muscles, the action potential causes the muscle to contract. So remember, muscle cells, rather like nerve cells, are excitable. If I stimulate the muscle with a nerve impulse, then the muscle develops its own action potential. And that action potential will run through the whole muscle cell and cause it to contract. But there's no muscle action potential that can cause the muscle to extend. It can only contract. So the muscle cell is actually extensible. That's in the next property. It can be stretched as long as it's relaxed. By relaxation in a muscle, we mean that the myosin has let go of the actin. Okay. If the myosin is grabbed onto the actin fibers and pull them together to make the cell shorten. But then the myosin lets go of the actin fibers. The muscle now is extensible. We can extend it. And we can extend it because it is elastic. If I now pull on that muscle, the fibers inside the muscle cell simply slide apart. It is elastic. Okay, so remember these four. It is contractile, it is excitable, extensible, and elastic. Here's the way in which these fibers inside the cell are arranged. I showed you this before. This is actin here. These are actin filaments here. They are very thin, very strong. Actin is a protein, and it is anchored here. This repeats over and over and over and over down the muscle. And in striated muscle, very easy to see. This is what produces those striations in the muscle. Now, in between the actin fibers, there are bands of myosin here. Myosin is a motor protein. You saw motor proteins, we talked about them before. Motor proteins could walk along protein fibers like this, carrying things like a vesicle or an organelle, could walk along like that. Myosin is just like that, excepting that myosin is fixed. And under certain circumstances, when it's given the signal, when an action potential is passed through the cell, myosin will reach out, grab an actin fiber, and then pull it. So it will pull the fibers together. It will slide these together when an muscle action potential is generated. When that action potential is finished, the myosin just lets go. This muscle cell will only will be put back to its original length by opposing muscles pulling on it. For example, many of our voluntary muscles are paired in opposing muscle groups. So we have a biceps and a triceps. Flex biceps, it's contracted, I relax it, I haven't got it contracted anymore, it's relaxed. Now I can stretch it open by using the opposing muscle group on the other side, which is now contracted. Okay, so that is the way most of our muscle groups work. They work in opposition to one another. So we need to just understand a bit about how the muscle actually, how this contraction is actually generated. So the first thing is we'll talk here about voluntary muscle as shown here. And each of these here is a muscle fiber. So that's a muscle cell, that's a muscle cell, that's a muscle cell. So these are all bundled together in a muscle fiber bundle. And here is the nerve, which is going to instruct these cells to contract. This is a single nerve, but look how it's structured. At its end, it has many branches, and each of those branches is extending to a different muscle cell. So this is like almost like a tree shape at the end of the nerve. So when a nerve action potential comes down here to instruct the muscle cells to contract, that nerve impulse is dispersed all across the muscle to each of the muscle cells. And if the nerve impulse is strong enough, then it's going to the muscle is going to generate its own action potential. So the nerve needs to communicate with the muscle cell. And it does so. It doesn't send an electrical pulse across. Instead, it sends a chemical message, and that is called a neurotransmitter. The nerve endings here release a neurotransmitter, and is called, in this case, here's a name I do want you to remember, is called acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is a specific neurotransmitter which is released at a neuromuscular junction, and that is what this is. This is a neuromuscular junction. Acetylcholine is released. If enough acetylcholine is picked up by this muscle cell, then it will cause an action potential to be generated in that muscle cell, and the muscle cell will contract. So there's a specific sequence of events, which I'll go through really slowly, and we'll perhaps repeat it next time. If that stimulus is big enough, the muscle generates its own action potential, and that is propagated through the whole muscle fiber. And remember, in voluntary muscle, they're huge big cells without cross walls. So the action potential runs very quickly through the whole cell. It does something very specific. And I want to remind you, I did tell you about this before in muscle cells, the endoplasmic reticulum in muscle cells is highly specialized. It's called sarcoplasmic reticulum, and it's a store of calcium. The sarcoplasmic reticulum, endoplasmic reticulum, it's just got another name because it's in muscle cells, is specialized because it stores calcium, and when an action potential comes, the endoplasmic reticulum releases calcium into the muscle cell, and then immediately begins to pump it back in again. It doesn't want calcium lying around inside that cell. It briefly releases calcium, and then begins pumping it back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. That calcium that is released is what causes the myosin to reach out. As this gets flooded with calcium, that is what causes the myosin to reach out and grab the actin and slide it together. Immediately that action potential is done, the sarcoplasmic reticulum sucks up all the calcium and the myosin lets go because there's no more calcium. And so that is a contraction. And then the opposing muscles need to stretch it out again as long as the myosin has let go. There is one circumstance where we can see what the impact of calcium, and that is after death. When organism dies, the sarcoplasmic reticulum loses its ability to work, and it releases all of its calcium into the muscle. And what happens then is that the muscles actually contract and stiffen, and they don't relax. They don't relax for a very long time, for days, because the calcium's hanging around, and that is the phenomenon of rigor mortis. Rigor mortis arises because cells are flooded with calcium released from the dying sarcoplasmic reticulum. Eventually, the muscle will relax simply because everything decays. The myosin dies, the actin dies, etc., etc. It loses its ability to interact. And then the muscle will relax again. But that stiffening of rigor mortis is because of this uncontrolled release of calcium, which is not then sucked back up again. So the myosin keeps holding on to the actin. Okay. Oh, yes, here's the three. Let's stop here. This is skeletal muscle, clearly striated, big, long cells, many nuclei, no crosswalk. This is smooth muscle. This is lens-shaped cells, the single nucleus, no visible striations. They still have actin and myosin. This is cardiac muscle. Cardiac muscle has some similarities to skeletal muscle. It's faintly striated, but it has branches between the different cells. So that, and remember, cardiac muscle generates its own action potential continuously. It generates its own action potential continuously. So cardiac muscle cells continually twitch in response to that inherent action potential. We'll leave it there. We'll finish muscles on Wednesday, and then afterwards we will have a question period. So I'll see you on Wednesday. Remember, it's a live class on Wednesday.